First, I'd like to thank Rena and the Niles S&A Silent Film Museum, and I'd like to thank all of you for taking a chance on this. I've called my talk, How Movies Coped When the Wrong People Went to See Them. And what I'm going to be doing is explaining who those wrong people were and how the film industry worked to set matters right. The industry I have in mind is the one that produced so many of the films that we see here at the museum, movies that were made before there were feature films, before movie palaces, and before Hollywood. More precisely, the era when movies were the domain of the Nickelodeon between 1905 and 1912. The Nickelodeon is of interest, I think, not just because it was the first theater specifically designed to show movies, but because the strategies the operators used to cultivate their audiences have proven so influential and explain how conceptions of the audience helped to drive the kinds of movies the burgeoning studios produced. So first, just to be sure that we're all on the same page, let me remind you of what the Nickelodeon was. By 1910, there were about 10,000 of them in all, but no two of them were exactly alike. They ranged from the elegant, like this theater here, the Comique, to the flea pit. As often as not, it was a makeshift showplace, a converted dance hall, restaurant, pawn shop, or cigar store made over to look like a vaudeville emporium. In San Francisco, the Nasser brothers created the Nickelodeon that you're looking at now from a family grocery store on 18th and Collingwood. This Nickelodeon was made from a livery stable. Or the Nickelodeon could be a variety theater that simply decided to add movies to the live acts. For 10 cents or more, Nickelodeons were seldom a nickel, the early moviegoer went inside and saw a miscellany of short adventure, comedy, or fantasy films that lasted about 45 minutes to an hour. What movies to show, what live acts to put in between, and how to arrange them all were decisions left to the individual theater owner, who generally improvised like mad. When San Francisco's DJ Grauman showed Méliès A Trip to the Moon at the unique theater that he owned, he had actors stand behind the screen to give the movie dialogue and narration. In Oakland, the manager of the Hippodrome stood on the balcony with a megaphone to wave in customers. Then there was the revolving billboard on top of the unique theater down on Market in San Francisco, where that would change every half hour or so. Well, movies were always the main attraction, but enterprising managers followed the formula created by William Fox and Marcus Lowe in 1906 and enhanced their programs with sing-alongs, cheap vaudeville acts, and illustrated lectures. First came the greeting. Then an illustrated song when you were expected to join in the chorus. A singer would perform the song by herself, accompanied by custom-made hand-colored magic lantern slides, ballads, rags, and waltzes. Then the singer famously called out to the audience to join in the chorus. The manager might then present his first movie or bring in a live comedian, a dog act, or an acrobat, or maybe a ventriloquist. When the Nasser brothers, the men who later built the Castro, created their Liberty Nickelodeon in the back of their grocery store, one of the prize attractions was a fellow who ate nails 5 shows a day. Those of you who saw our recreation of the Nickelodeon program called The Great Nickelodeon Show may remember how we paid tribute to this fellow with Mr. Blockhead, who hammered 2-inch nails up his nose. Say what you will, I promise that once you saw it, you never forgot it. At the other end of the spectrum, a manager might go straight to one of his most prestigious acts, actually the most prestigious act, the illustrated lecture. One of the ones we use is The Assassination of William McKinley, based on a 1904 script with hand-colored slides that were originally used in a circus sideshow and then recycled for the Nickelodeon. Let me give you just a taste of how this might go. It would begin this illustrated lecture with a lecturer in a frock coat saying something like this. He is proud to present divertissements revealing life in all its colors, for we must never forget that even amidst joy, there is consequence, as we are too forcibly reminded by the fate of our martyred president, William McKinley. What followed was then a hodgepodge of sources, hand-colored photos of the event itself, drawings, staged reenactments, and more allegorical combinations. All this and 3 or 4 1- and 2-reel films. So that was the program. Their golden age was brief, lasting scarcely 9 years. Nickelodeons were dinosaurs by the start of the First World War. But in those years, they were an entertainment phenomenon. As I mentioned, by 1910, more than 10,000 of them had sprung up across the country, catering to an audience crazy for the movies. The lion's share of that audience came from the ghetto, a fact that Nickelodeon commentators never tired of discovering. The labels used over and again by journalists commenting on the 5-cent movie house, usually written with the delighted air of having discovered the exact phrase, was democracy's theater. A Russell Sage survey revealed that in 1911, 78% of the New York audience consisted of members from the working class, at a time when the workers had been effectively disenfranchised from the older arts. You cannot go to any one of these picture shows in New York, wrote Mary Vorst for the Outlook in 1911, without blessing the moving picture book that has brought so much into the lives of people who work. They will stay as long as the slums stay, wrote Joseph Medill Patterson, for in the slums they are the fittest and must survive. The custodians of the poor took for granted that movies were made for the immigrant, the working man, children, and the unemployed. If Tolstoy were alive today, the Nation claimed a year after he died, it is not unlikely that he would have found in the movies a close approximation to his ideal of art. The Russian's ultimate test of a work of art was to appeal to the untutored but unspoiled peasant, the man who is today the nickel theater's most faithful customer. Identification of the audience as working class also helped in the Nickelodeon's fight against municipal censorship. Let me take a second to show how the reasoning went. The argument was that if the movies were working class entertainment and the legitimate theater was a non-working class entertainment, it followed that any effort at censoring the movies was class legislation, calculated to impose harsher standards on the poor man's theater than on that of his wealthier counterpart. Many welfare agencies, seeing the Nickelodeon's appeal, followed the lead of Jane Addams at Hull House and used movies as part of educational and rehab programs for the poor. The United States Navy, which at that time enlisted over 5,000 immigrants per year, began in September of 1910 to manufacture a series of recruiting films that played in nickel theaters and in recruiting stations across the country. To that audience, movies meant escape in the most literal sense. The most important films were heavyweight prize fights, slapstick, and French chase comedies. What's most notable, in fact, is the incredible stress on violent slapstick and knockabout humor. To give you an idea, I went through the pages of the trade journal The Moving Picture World for 1 month, July 1908, to find what was playing in New York that month. And here's what I came up with. Like most movies from the period, these particular titles are all lost. But to give you something of the flavor, I've put together scenes from other films for the same time that work in the same style. So here we go. Photographs When Casey Joined the Lodge, reviewed on the 4th of July of 1908, features two Irishmen at a lodge initiation fighting each other with bricks and tossing sticks of dynamite under lodge members, cops, and innocent bystanders. 2 weeks later, Vitagraph followed up with A Policeman's Dream, in which two boys awaken a daydreaming patrolman by setting him on fire. Neither the cop nor the boys are beaten, an exceptional outcome. In other comedies from July, a political candidate has dirt and paste thrown over him, then his wife beats him. Partygoers fall into a young man's room when a floor caves in and they are then beaten. A gentleman endeavoring to be polite to all mankind keeps bumping into things and receives many an unkind block and boost for his trouble. Then there were the actualities, the name given to documentaries at the turn of the century. Films like Electrocuting an Elephant, Inside a Slaughterhouse, or The Execution of Leon Czolgosz with a panorama of Auburn Prison. These were by no means the only kinds of movies being shown, but knockabout ruled. Just as striking, at least for me, is how little, aside from the violence, they reveal about actual American life. Later historians would claim that such movies worked as part of the immigrants' acculturation to American society. But in reality, few movies of this period directly performed any such task. In fact, most of these movies were produced in France, as were two of the three that we've been watching. They were the exports of the Pathé Frere Company, who single-handedly released more movies in the United States than all the major American companies combined. Or they were trick films produced by Georges Méliès, or slapsticks and travelogues from Gaumont and Lumiere. In short, the films were being offered as spectacles that induced the onlooker to marvel at the unnatural, whether in the form of a slapstick chase, a comic dream, a wondrous adventure, or a historical disaster. Those who saw them didn't learn much. It was rather the act of going to the movies that mattered most. But how did this all change? How did we get from this working class theater, supported and paid for by the poor, to the broader, more affluent white-collar trade? How did theater operators finally attract that middle-class audience originally so reluctant to peer inside early movie houses? Usually, we're told, it didn't happen until the First World War, when feature films arrived with movie stars like Charlie Chaplin, Douglas Fairbanks, and William S. Hart, and the Nickelodeon was abandoned in favor of larger theaters and finally the movie palace. I want to contradict that, arguing that the middle-class audiences were already in the theaters, waiting for the features and movie stars that would follow. The seduction of the affluent occurred, I'm going to argue, in the preceding years, between 1905 and 1912, in precisely that theater supposedly reserved for the blue-collar worker. The dark secret of Nickelodeon movies is that they may have been widely regarded as the worker's pastime, but the theater catered to him through necessity, not through choice. The blue-collar working man and his family may have supported the Nickelodeon, but the scandal was that no one connected with the movies much wanted that support, least of all the immigrant film exhibitors who were working their way out of the slums with their theaters. The exhibitors' abiding complaint against Nickelodeon audiences, voiced with monotonous regularity in trade journals, personal correspondence, and in congressional testimony, was that moviegoers as a group lacked class. A movie customer wearing a suit or an officer's military uniform was a momentous event. A car parked outside the theater was reason for a letter to the moving picture world. By contrast, certain kinds of workers were discouraged and occasionally even banned from the movies. An extreme example is the case of the shantytown Nickelodeons at the Portsmouth and Charleston naval shipyards that favored military officers with reduced admission prices while they refused admittance to enlisted men. Writing sympathetically of this policy, a trade editor reasoned, "One way to keep trouble out of a theater is not to admit it in the first place. The roughhouse germ is present to a greater or lesser extent in every squad of sailors. The manager has reason to know in advance whether they are friend or foe, and therefore one cannot blame a manager in Portsmouth or any other place for using his discretionary powers, whether it involves the livery of Uncle Sam or Johnny Bull or anybody else." Meanwhile, big city Nickelodeon operators were cautioned against earning reputations as ethnic theaters and given ground rules for attracting a mixed house. 1, operators should avoid booking programs heavily slanted towards any one nationality. 2, avoid ethnic vaudeville acts. And 3, eliminate all songs in foreign languages. Embarrassed by their regulars, ambitious managers constantly sought ways to attract the larger middle-class family trade, currently the domain of vaudeville theaters and the legitimate stage. That thirst for affluence and respectability also helps explain the curious locations of the original Nickelodeons. Even when they were working-class entertainments, the most important Nickelodeons were seldom built in the workers' community or in their shopping areas. Instead, they customarily opened in business districts on the outer edges of the slums, but fringing white-collar shopping centers accessible to blue-collar workers, but even closer to the professional class trade. So, to give you a better idea, let's go to Manhattan, home of somewhere between 200 and 300 nickel theaters in a city of nearly 5 million souls. It's a city of immigrants, and the largest working class immigrant neighborhoods are spread across town. Just to orient you, on the top of the map, here in East Harlem, between Lenox and 3rd, we have the busiest vaudeville theater and business centers in New York City. In 1910, it's predominantly Jewish, somewhat upscale, brownstones being turned into boarding houses. And then here's Yorkville, just below it, an immigrant mashup, Germans, Irish, Jews. Here's where the Marx Brothers were born and raised. And then to the west side, here's San Juan Hill, the African-American ghetto. It's filled with factories, tenements, ramshackle wooden brick houses. It's, by the way, where Fats Waller came from and where the Charleston got its start. Later, it became the site for Lincoln Center. The original was torn down just as West Side Story was turned into a movie, and that was shot here. And then just below it, there's Hell's Kitchen, mostly Irish, as the name implies, a hellish place, near the Hudson River, where tanneries, slaughterhouses, and distilleries dumped their waste. Appropriately, later it's where the Taxi Driver takes place. But far and away, the biggest and most intensely populated section of the city was the Lower East Side, the melting pot at its most intense, defined by ethnic conclave. So here is where we're told that the lion's share of the movie audiences came from. So if that's the case, where were the Nickelodeons? Well, how about Hester Street down here, or maybe Rivington Street above it, or East Houston, or maybe Broome Street. These were the great market streets in the Jewish Lower East Side. It's where you could reasonably expect to find those theaters, thriving amidst the open markets of the Lower East Side. So here, feeding off East Houston, is the remarkable Yiddish theater district, the so-called Jewish Rialto, where George and Ira Gershwin wrote music. It's where Paul Muni got his start, acting in the great Yiddish melodramas of the day. So, theaters, yes. Nickelodeons, no. Well then, how about the Bowery, the oldest street in the city, where variety theaters once thrived, but now a skid row, ever since it got stuck under the shadow of the 3rd Avenue L. Noisy, dirty. By 1910, a haven for the homeless, for brothels and saloons. Now, it's true, you could find a few Nickelodeons here, but they weren't theaters. These were the cheap converted pawn shops, the cigar stores, barber shops that I mentioned at the outset. And they had a very short life expectancy. Those converted shops stayed as Nickelodeons on an average for less than a year. Well then, how about the 5 Points down here towards the bottom of the frame? The notorious Irish neighborhood that had now been taken over by Italians. Not very likely. Nearby is the Lung Block, notorious for the infestation of tuberculosis, where the infant mortality rate was 5 times what it was in the rest of the city. No theaters of any kind were in that part of the Lower East Side. But then, how about Mulberry Street in Little Italy, the center of what was now the most important Italian neighborhood, and another thriving neighborhood, where you can also find Italian dance halls, amusement bands, and small opera houses. It's also where you can find the dead body of the mafia padrone that Vito Corleone shoots in Godfather Part 2. It's where that religious parade in Godfather Part 2 precedes the killing. That's where it all takes place. But what doesn't take place is movie going. No Nickelodeons. And now we come to the most interesting of the sections in terms of theaters, the most intriguing locations of all, Chinatown, the one and only non-white quarter of the neighborhood, in the hood that came closest to being turned into a tourist attraction. Becoming a tourist attraction was largely a survival strategy, where Chinatown played off the stereotypes of being the other by turning Chinatown into an entertainment zone. Starting in the late 1890s, large restaurants appeared decorated with dragons and paper lanterns, some made to look like pagodas with pagoda roofs, balconies, and colorful columns. The district became famous for its saloons, its beer gardens, and nightclubs aimed at the tourist trade. There were even puppet theaters, Chinese and Balinese shadow puppets. And here's where Al Jolson got started, in Chinatown saloons as a singing waiter. Irving Berlin, too, a Jewish composer who writes White Christmas and Easter Parade, getting started in a Chinese neighborhood singing vaudeville ditties. He had company, including Jimmy Durante, yet another Chinatown entertainer. Lots of entertainment, but again, no Nickelodeons. So that's where the audiences were. Well, where the heck were the Nickelodeons? And the answer is here. Almost all of them outside the Lower East Side ghetto. Mainly, they're on 14th Street around Union Square, up to 2 miles away, or if you could afford it, up to 7 subway stops on the IRT. With the decay of the Bowery, this was your nearest theater district, the movies hoping to muscle in where vaudeville theaters and dime museums had established themselves. The relevant point for us, it was far closer to middle-class neighborhoods than it was to the Lower East Side. So if you were living here in this Union Square, 14th Street district, near Gramercy Park, Stuyvesant Square, or off Astor Place, you weren't walking 2 miles to see a movie. You were a few blocks away. And you could also consider yourself part of a gentrified neighborhood. 3 icons to put a sharp point to this. First, Luchow's, one of New York's most famous restaurants, elegant and expensive. Or up here, Arnold Constable's Emporium, an enormous upscale department store on Broadway between Tammany Hall and Gramercy Park, or just below it, Tony Pastor's Variety Theater, the most famous vaudeville house in the country, where many stars got their start, including Buster Keaton and his family. So you're getting the picture, I hope. True, the neighborhood was losing the luster that it had in the 19th century. But 14th Street had the perfect demographic for the Nickelodeon. Like 125th Street in East Harlem, Union Square had an outcropping of working class customers, but was in a neighborhood dominated by white-collar workers. So promoters got busy, leasing small-time theaters and converting them into movie houses. They're here on the east side, along from East 14th Street, across from Union Square's Park, extending to the 3rd Avenue L on the east side. Here's where the earliest movie chains got started. Adolf Zucker, who of course later creates Paramount, has his first theater here called the Automatic Vaudeville, opened in 1908. Don't be misled by the title or the price. For a penny, you only got to see a peep show, one of those machines you looked through while cranking it yourself. That was the vaudeville part. But you see that smaller sign under the lower arch that says Crystal Hall? That's where you went to see the movies. Upstairs in a theater where Zucker charged you a nickel or a dime. Here's a wider view. You can barely see it, but if you look at the top of the Automatic, you can see a sign surrounded by rotating lights saying moving pictures. It is right there. Next door, there's the Comedy Theater, and down the block, B.F. Keith's Union Square Theater, soon to become the Bijou Dream. Keith is another important name. He is the K in RKO. Around the corner, another landmark Nickelodeon, though I couldn't find a picture of it. You've heard of the AMC theater chain, AMC Theaters. The Plexes started here. The brainchild of Marcus Lowe, who opened the People's Vaudeville Theater on 14th Street in 1909, then expanded with a small chain of Nickelodeons, leading to a nationwide chain of lavish movie palaces called Lowe's Theater. If you're in the Bronx, you call them Loewy's Theater. Then, to service his theaters, Lowe created MGM and hired Louis B. Mayer to run it. Today, AMC includes the Lowe's empire among its houses. Well, one block over, the most elaborate Nickelodeon of all, the Unique at 136 East 14th, the flagship in William Fox's growing chain. Now, when you see it like this in a trade magazine, it doesn't look that much different from its neighbors. But that's not the image that Fox wants to project. This is more like it, very much posed, hand-colored photograph. Well, and you notice, by the way, the clientele, all actors and models in their bowlers, ties, jackets, women in full dress costume, were the audience that Fox is trying to project. Well, for me, it's astonishing. 4 of the 5 major Hollywood studios are founded by Jewish Nickelodeon operators, all working within 2 blocks of each other. And the only reason the Warner Brothers weren't there is because they were operating their Nickelodeons in and around Pittsburgh. Virtually all of these theaters would be gone by 1916, but that's only because their operators had gone to bigger things. But that's not the end of it. Ambitious Nickelodeon operators continued to chase hotels and live theaters up Broadway like wolves after moose. From Union Square, they invade Madison Square on 23rd Street. By 1914, they're up in the notorious Tenderloin District, better known at the time as Satan's Circus, all the way up to Herald Square on 34th Street. And that may be the most interesting move of all. let's see if I can find it. At Herald Square, they are a magnet for legitimate theaters and hotels. What I'm looking for is the Waldorf Astoria. It's only a block or two away from where the newest Nickelodeons are. They at last have access not just to local neighborhoods, but to out-of-towners, suburbanites coming in from the suburbs and boroughs thanks to Penn Station, the BMT, and Grand Central Terminal. In other words, an affluent, floating clientele, day trippers into the city with money to shop and to catch a film or two while on a break. In short, the ideal cross-section audience has arrived. Would you like to see what San Francisco Nickelodeons looked like? Here they are at the same time. Before the 1906 quake, the Nickelodeon era had barely gotten started. We were still in the era of penny arcades, dime museums, and peep shows located next to vaudeville theaters in Lower Market Street. So, you recognize this. We're watching the famous movie that Herbert Miles made of the traffic on Market Street a few days before the Great Quake. Here it is on the right, all but invisible, the city's first movie theater, Will First's Cineograph. Across the street in the Phelan building, a peep show arcade run by Peter Bacigalupi. Here's a better view. There is the Cineograph. Well, first of all, here is the Sanford Vale department store, it's a huge store, and it's the Cineograph that is right next to it. As best I can tell, the flyer for the Cineograph is the earliest Nickelodeon advertisement in San Francisco. Then came the 1906 fire and earthquake. And you get a better view of it with its fancy dome right next to that same department store. The Nickelodeon next to it, the Cineograph, is hidden because the Cineograph comes out a little, and so it overshadows its next door neighbor, the Unique. But the theater next to that, the third Nickelodeon, the one in white, is called the Puritan, and that you can see. Along with everything else, the Nickelodeons are burnt to the ground, and they never return. The earthquake and fire wipe the slate clean. Theaters need to be built afresh. Their first impulse is to build in the Fillmore Western Addition that had been spared the earthquake and the fire. This was a blue-collar neighborhood where migrant groups and predominated. Fillmore and McAllister Streets were lined with Jewish-owned restaurants, bakeries, shops, and kosher markets. This is also where the Chutes was about to reopen, a mammoth Coney Island amusement park concentrated in a single square block. And this is where the first houses opened after the fire. But it doesn't work. This may have been a working class neighborhood, but there were no legitimate or vaudeville theaters built for the movies to lean on, nor a nearby affluent professional class. The Chutes fail, and so do the Nickelodeons. Instead, the movies return to market between 3rd Street and 4th and up past Powell Street. Some 9 Nickelodeons by my count, run by the movers and shakers of the trade. It's where the Portola Theater is built, arguably the largest Nickelodeon in the city. It's also where San Francisco's only known Nickelodeon to survive is located. That would be the Mayo Biograph. No longer, it's true, a Biograph or a Nickelodeon, but hey, it still survives. Around the corner on Powell Street, the Edison Nickelodeon. Here is the Edison in its prime. Here it is until the 70s, a gay porno theater. So as far as the industry is concerned, the problem is how to lure that affluent family trade so near and yet so far? The answer, at times conscious, but more frequently an intuitive matter of convenience, was through the new American woman and her children. If few professional men would as yet, by 1910, consider taking their families to the Nickelodeon, the woman on a shopping break or children out from school provided the ideal lifeline to the affluent bourgeoisie. Statistically, women and children numbered only 30% of the New York audience, even less than that during performances after 8 o'clock. But they commanded the special attention of both the industry and its censors. In a trade hungry for respectability, the middle-class woman was respectability incarnate. Her very presence in the theater refuted the vituperative accusations lodged against the common show's corrupting vulgarity. Theaters spared few efforts to woo her. It wasn't just a matter of mirrors in the lobby. Soon after Boston's theater premiere established the policy of giving free admission tickets to women for pre-noon shows, the Olympic Theater reacted by charging women and children half fare at all screenings, and thereby set the precedent that virtually all the major Boston Nickelodeons adopted. By the end of 1910, women and children were charged half fare in all of Philadelphia Nickelodeon theaters, while with growing frequency, exhibitors' complaints about the movies took the form of gallant defenses of the females' tender sensibilities. What they did not do, rather conspicuously, is sell the movie theater as a place for dating. This was family entertainment, not a place to cuddle in the dark. Not that anybody was fooled. For instance, songs about the Nickelodeon were all about what you could get away with in the dark. As one song put it, at the 10-cent movie show, where all the lights were turned down low, oh, what heaven, oh, what bliss, not a kiss would Johnny miss. When the lights went up, uh-oh, just like an angel sat up Flo. But when the two of them were going, they had everybody rowing at the 10-cent movie show. There was even blowback. Your idea of a date is to spend a nickel on me? Nickelodeons as a passion pit, calling Dr. Freud, the dark side of luring women into a theater that was striving to be respectable became the industry's repressed id. There were other tensions as well. The pressure to keep movies popular was offset by pressure to keep them respectable. Film producers drew heavily on the literary lions for uplifting stories. Émile Zola, Edgar Allan Poe, Tolstoy, Dumas, Victor Hugo, Mark Twain, and Shakespeare. At times, the tension between the two conflicting impulses, popularity and respectability, yielded bizarre results. When in 1910, Vitagraph filmed Sophocles' Electra in one reel, exhibitors were told to bill it like a circus. It will draw bigger crowds than any film you have ever had. In Louis B. Mayer's Orpheum Theater, Pathé's passion play, The Life of Christ from the Annunciation to the Ascension in 27 beautiful scenes, was followed the next week by Balao, the Demon Baboon. Both were successful. But the more sophisticated and plausible lures came from the new blood drifting into the film production studios and with the films that they were making. Filmmakers and their films are, of course, products of their own time and social background. And like our theater owners, the directors, writers, and producers had aspirations of their own. Early filmmakers such as Thomas Ince, Edwin S. Porter, Lois Weber, Stanley Alcott, Alan Dwan, or Alice Guy Blaché, each had their own personal histories, but despite their many differences, they were all bourgeois Gentiles, virtually all of them theater folk. True, several of them were immigrants, but immigrants from Canada, the UK, and France, rather than from Eastern Europe, comfortably living on family incomes ranging from $800 to $1,000 per month, when the national average was under $600 per year. The most important and influential of these directors, D.W. Griffith from Louisville, Kentucky, made as much as $37,000 a year, somewhere between what New York's Chief Justice and the President of the United States earned. They told the stories they knew best, and inevitably, as they became articulate, their films revealed their own middle-class background. The genres they created and adapted for the movies, the Western, detective dramas, Civil War romances, family comedies, which was their version of the sitcom, crime films, and the infinitude of literary adaptations, all were calculated to appeal to the family trade. Their perpetual quest for acceptance among their own kind provided special pressure to return to formulas and characters approved by the guardians of popular culture. Few, if any, films stressed ethnic ties. Few chronicled adventures of immigrants, their arrival in the New World, life in tenements, or until Griffith appeared, working conditions in shops or factories. No one with prominent ethnic features was permitted in leading roles. The American blue-eyed, brown-haired beauty was required, whether playing an Italian street singer, a geisha, a Dutch daughter, a Sioux Indian maiden, a Spanish duenna, or a Gibson girl. African Americans, like Hispanics, were almost invariably portrayed by white actors in black and brown face, perpetuating degrading stereotypes. In the midst of a strange new audience, the industry clung to the vestiges of safe, old theatrical patterns. Well, there is much to say about these strategies. Opportunistic, aggressive, hypocritical, biased. But two words may suffice. They worked. So we've seen since then how Hollywood coped to keep its audiences and build on them through assorted crises. For example, the competition from radio, the coming of sound, the Great Depression, competition from television, the divorcement decrees, and now, of course, the COVID-19 epidemic. But what I've been hoping to show is how Nickelodeons created that core audience and shaped it, enabling Hollywood to build and survive. Well, thanks for your attention, and hope that you found something of interest.